Welcome to Outside Views, where we take an in-depth look at the obstacles the UK would face if it ever were to apply for EU membership again. Brexit is increasingly regarded as a mistake, and many Britons now favour joining the EU again. But what would that actually mean? Well, today we continue our BRITURN series, where we explore the challenges of the accession process. And in this episode, we examine Chapter 34, Institutions. When discussing the prospect of the UK joining the European Union again, which is not a rejoin, we must understand that there is no shortcut or special treatment for a former member. The UK would have to apply like any other country, and that means fulfilling the so-called Copenhagen criteria. And these criteria demand stable democratic institutions, a functioning market economy, and the ability to adopt the entire body of EU law, known as the acquis. Every applicant follows the same process, meaning this is not a negotiation in the way many would assume looking at the name of it. The EU does not bargain over its rules. The applicant country must align with them. And Chapter 34 deals with the institutional framework of the EU. When a country joins the European Union, it must integrate into the existing structures, ensuring equal representation in the European Parliament, the Council, the European Commission, the Court of Justice, and other key EU institutions. This is a significant and complex process, as it involves legal, political, and procedural adaptations. For the UK, this would mean reintegrating into an institutional framework it previously left, but under different circumstances. One of the most fundamental aspects of this chapter is representation in the EU institutions, as I said. And if the UK were to join again, it would need to elect members of the European Parliament to represent its citizens. Before Brexit, the UK had 73 MEPs, and their departure redistributed those seats among the remaining member states. Joining the EU again would require an adjustment of parliamentary representation, meaning a new distribution of seats, which could require renegotiations with existing member states. Similarly, the UK would regain a seat in the European Council, where the heads of governments meet to set the EU's political direction. However, post-Brexit, the political dynamics within the EU have shifted. France and Germany have taken a more central role, while new alliances have formed among remaining members. The UK's re-entry into the setting would not be as simple as picking up where it left off. It would need to rebuild political relationships and prove itself as a reliable partner after its previous departure. The European Commission is another key institution where joining again presents challenges. Each member state nominates a commissioner who is then assigned a portfolio. The UK, if it were to join again, would need to nominate a commissioner who would then be subject to approval by the European Parliament and the Council. So much about unelected bureaucrats. However, the UK's history with the Commission is complicated. Before Brexit, the UK often sought opt-outs and special arrangements within the EU. Rebuilding trust and ensuring that a UK commissioner would be fully committed to EU integration would be a significant hurdle. A critical procedural element under this chapter is voting rights within the Council of the EU. Decisions in the Council are made using a qualified majority voting system, meaning each country has a weighted vote depending on its population size. Before Brexit, the UK had a significant voting share. Joining again would require recalculating voting weights, which could affect the balance of power among existing member states. Some countries may be hesitant to adjust the current system, fearing that the UK's re-entry would shift voting dynamics in ways that disrupt the balance of influence. Another essential part of Chapter 34 concerns official languages. The UK's return to the EU would not require changes in language policy, as English remains an official EU language due to Ireland and Malta. However, Brexit has reduced the prominence of English in EU institutions, with French and German gaining greater prominence in internal communications. If the UK were to join again, it might push for a stronger role for English within EU institutions, something that could face resistance from other member states. Beyond institutional representation, this chapter also ensures that an acceding country has the administrative and procedural capacity to participate fully in EU decision-making. And this means setting up domestic mechanisms to coordinate with EU institutions, appointing diplomats and legal experts to engage with EU bodies, and ensuring that national laws are aligned with EU government structures. While the UK has experience in these areas, the reality is that since Brexit, its institutional alignment with the EU has diminished. Rebuilding administrative structures to facilitate seamless integration into EU decision-making would take time and resources. A particularly important transitional measure under this chapter is the period of active observer status. After an accession treaty is signed but before full membership takes effect, the acceding country is granted observer status in EU institutions. This means that UK representatives would be allowed to participate in discussions within the European Parliament, the Council, and Commission committees, but without voting rights. And this phase is designed to ensure a smooth transition, allowing the UK to familiarize itself with current EU processes before becoming a full member. However, this period could also be politically challenging, as the UK would be engaged in EU decision-making without yet having formal influence over policy outcomes. Another key aspect of Chapter 34 is the adaptation of procedural rules to accommodate a new member. Accession often leads to minor changes in EU treaties and institutional frameworks to reflect the addition of a new member state. For the UK, this would require negotiations with existing members to determine how its return would affect procedural operations. While these adjustments are usually straightforward, they still require agreement from all existing EU members, meaning the UK's return to the institutional framework would be subject to approval by each member state. A final consideration under this chapter is public perception and political willingness. EU institutions do not operate in isolation. They are shaped by the political will of their member states. Since Brexit, public sentiment in some EU countries has become skeptical about the idea of the UK joining again. Some leaders may demand assurances that the UK is fully committed to EU membership this time without seeking opt-outs or special privileges. This means that any reintegration into EU institutions would require strong political messaging from the UK government to demonstrate its long-term commitment to the European project. Ultimately, Chapter 34 is about ensuring that a new member state is fully integrated into the EU's institutional framework in a way that maintains the stability and effectiveness of EU governance. For the UK, completing this chapter would involve regaining representation in EU institutions, rebuilding administrative structures, adapting to procedural changes, and reassuring other member states that it is ready to be a reliable partner. It would not be an automatic process. It would require diplomatic negotiations, institutional restructuring, and, most of all, political commitment. That's it for today's episode of BRITURN, and if you found this video informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. How do you see the UK handling especially this chapter of the accession process? I'll see you in the next episode, of course. That will be in 2 days. It will be the final episode of that, but between that we talk a little bit more about something else. And if you want to see something else right now, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.